Behind the net, centers, flat, tries to Clark, shot, oh, rebound, scores! It's for the game winner at 12 minutes and 1 second of Sunday.
Hey everybody, it's Isaiah. Just reminding you that FlyersNittyGritty.com and the O&B Puckcast are brought to you by Summit Public Adjusters. Hey, do you have damage to your home? Not sure who to call? We suggest that you call Summit Public Adjusters before your insurance company. Dealing with your insurance company can be very stressful. Let Summit take the stress out of the claims process. From storm damage to your roof, to toilet overflows, to broken pipes and fires, Summit gets you the most money for your repairs. So next time Mother Nature leaves you in need of repairs, call Summit Public Adjusters at 215-752-0560 or visit summitpublicadjusters.com. Licensed in PA and New Jersey.
And we're back. It is Isaiah. Welcome to the O&B Puckcast, episode number 182. We're back a little sooner than you thought. And don't worry, Chef's still on vacation. But a couple things have come down the pike for the Philadelphia Flyers. And we felt like we just had to come back with a show. And he's playing hurt tonight. We really do appreciate it. But we do have the return of the great Dan Silver.
What's going on? Yeah, the fun, good news is I've been at 3 Flyers games in the last 2 weeks, all very exciting. The bad news is probably got COVID at one of them. So feeling a little under the weather, tested positive, but I'm a gamer. I'm going at it. Unlike the NHL where you weren't allowed to participate with COVID a few years ago, I'm participating. Isaiah gave me the thumbs up, so we're good to go.
Yeah. I ran it through my people and we ran it through the illegal people on the channels. That worked out. So, well, one of them didn't get back to me, but, sometimes you got to roll the dice. Anyway, before we introduce our esteemed guest, just a reminder, the O&B Puckcast can be followed on Twitter at O&B Puck, at O&B Puck. Our backup plan is Getter at O&B Puckcast, O&B Puckcast. And if you could rate and subscribe to the O&B Puckcast on Apple, Spotify, iHeart, TuneIn, Amazon, Audible, Google. We have a YouTube page. Just plug in O&B Puckcast. We have a Facebook page. Check it out. If you could follow and subscribe, it really helps move us up the charts when people are looking for Philadelphia Flyer podcasts, which is what we are. And it really has helped us with our subscription number of listeners. And we thank you as always. The next 5-star rating we get on Spotify, in particular on Apple, we will read it on the air. And with that, without any further ado, from the fourthperiod.com, Brotherly Puck, and a whole bunch of other stuff, including Stick to Hockey podcast with Jason Martinez, as our old buddy making his return to the O&B Puckcast, Anthony DiMarco. How are you, man?
Doing well, boys. Kind of a homecoming of sorts. Obviously, this is where I started way back when, and with my schedule kind of being less hectic, but also being more hectic nowadays, found the time and a lot of Flyer stuff to talk about, that's for sure.
There sure is. And before we get rolling into what's been happening over the last few days, you had some late breaking news from the fourthperiod.com update desk. What do you got for us?
You're talking about the news today?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, like I heard, I spoke to a very good source early this morning around 8:30, and it sounds, it's not official yet. And I was told that Macaulay doesn't even know, which is funny. And they didn't want it to get out, but I found it out through like some other secondhand sources, and I got it confirmed finally. I think the actual word was shoot. We didn't want this to get out, but that Alan Macaulay is trending towards being the official general manager of the Lehigh Valley Phantoms. When that announcement is going to be made official, I'm not too sure. Maybe there's a last second change, but I think it's looking that way. I've heard Danny Briere really likes him, and he's been the director of player personnel, I believe, for about 13, 14 months or so. I think he got elevated from his pro scout role to director of player personnel last February, if I'm not mistaken. So he's relatively new on the scene. So you don't want to try and lump him in right away with like the Chuck Fletcher era or even the Ron Hextall era. And, that's been a job that's unofficially been held by Brent Flair for quite some time, who also serves as assistant GM and executive vice president. But when Brent Flair has been away scouting as he oversees the draft, like he is right now, I've been told that he's out in Europe, it has fallen on the shoulders of the GM, which was Chuck Fletcher, which is now Danny Briere. And I think that they really want restructuring completely. They want everyone to do their job. I think Torts alluded to that yesterday about how there's a lot of bumping into each other. And that seems like one of the ducks they really want to get in a row, that one guy is going to be fully responsible for the Lehigh Valley Phantoms all the time. I don't think that's a foreign concept by any stretch. I did an interview with Chris Clark 2 weeks ago, who's the GM for the Cleveland Monsters, the Columbus Blue Jacks AHL affiliate. So I think it's a long time coming. Whether or not Alan McCauley does well, we'll see. But it seems like they are very high on him. Danny Briere is very high on him. And he is somewhat of a newer ad, even though he has kind of existed pre-Chuck Fletcher being fired.
Okay, the question becomes, Dan, is McCauley caulking the gap between Lehigh Valley and the Philadelphia Flyers?
So first of all, let's give some props to Anthony. He broke that. He also broke the story of the Flyers firing Chuck Fletcher, which is pretty incredible given how many national analysts were kind of like trying to figure that one out, and also the local guys. So Anthony, that was pretty awesome, man. I that was the wee hours of the morning, right?
Thank you, Dan. I really appreciate the props. I didn't sleep that night. I did not sleep. I was trying to get my editor, David Pagnotta, out of bed. He left his phone on silent. So he finally dragged his backside out of bed around 7:15, I believe. But yes, thank you very much. I do appreciate it. I know the Inquirer broke it officially, but yes, I got a text at 1:07 a.m., I believe. That's when I sent out the tweet. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I mean that's real reporting there, folks. It's and you're a pretty young guy, Anthony. I think it's pretty impressive what you've been able to do with getting some of those sources and everything. About the Phantoms, I don't really know much about McCauley. You kind of have to, I like the fact that they're restructuring there and they're going to have an actual GM just dedicated to the Phantoms. One thing I want to say is that I think Flyers fans were pretty skeptical about Ian LaPerriere. A lot of people didn't like what he did when he was an assistant coach with the Flyers, thought that he was just he was the good cop, right, is what we heard with the players. People maybe didn't think he was that smart. Sometimes he doesn't come across as that intelligent. Here's what you can't argue with. Since he's been down there with the Phantoms, you look at the players that have spent time there and have come back up, they've played pretty well. Like Cam York, John Tortorella was not happy with him at the beginning of the season. They send him down. Whatever happened down there, he came back up. He's been a different player. He's looked very good. He's looked like he's cementing himself as an integral part of the top 4 defensemen for this team for a long time moving forward. Tyson Forster, he came up, immediate impact. Egor Zamula spent a lot of time down there. His recent stretch of games with the Flyers, really good. Probably LaPerriere doesn't have a lot to do with the goalies, but Ersson, when he came up, really good. Like we've had so many development problems that I think that some props and credit has to go to what LaPerriere has done with these players that are coming up. And maybe it's just because they're a lot better than some of the other prospects that we've had go through there. But, I think that it's fairly impressive what he's done so far, and that team's in the thick of the playoff hunt. They're probably going to be in the playoffs. John Tortorella has made a point of saying how important it is. They sent down Forster and Zamula just because they want them to be part of that playoff push. So I think that as skeptical as we've been of the Flyers development and what's going on in Lehigh Valley, I think there's some signs that things are turning around there.
Yeah, for sure. And I think people have defaulted to not liking Ian LaPerriere because he's existed along with, I think he was around with Craig Berube. He stuck around during Dave Haxtell. He stuck around with Alain Vigneault. And obviously under Alain Vigneault, he wasn't in charge of the penalty kill. That job went to Mike Yeo, and he kind of took on the Darryl Williams role that we see nowadays. And yeah, the PK was complete garbage under him, no doubt. But how much of that was personnel? Because when the Flyers finally did have a season where they had good personnel and PK guys, let's say like a Tyler Pitlick of sorts, he wasn't in charge of it anymore. And that was a year where their PK was very solid under Mike Yeo. He goes down. Obviously, last year, a lot of criticism shot his way. But we also knew that Alain Vigneault told them to run the same system down there. So maybe he was handcuffed a little bit because of marching orders given to him from Alain Vigneault, at least until December of last season. You couple that with this season, John Tortorella takes the handcuffs off, run whatever system you want. And I think that we're finally starting to see some of the Brent Flair draft picks come up with Denwyer, Forster. Now we're seeing Ronnie Attard, of course. Andre just came over from Europe. Like, these are guys that we're finally starting to contribute to the team looking like the Flair Fletcher draft picks, who I do think, for all of the faults of the last regime, that they did have decent draft. I'm not going to sit here and say that Brent Flair's the greatest drafter in the history of the NHL, but I do think it's been above average. And I've heard that that's what Danny Briere likes as well, is that he said that, like, he likes his drafting going back to Minnesota. And is there an available person who would be better than Brent Flair? And I've also heard that Brent Flair was more in line with Danny Briere's line of thinking and actually disagreed with many of the contracts and decisions that Chuck Fletcher handed out towards the end of his tenure. And I'm guilty of this too, that I've written in this in my piece, and I heard from people in the organization that while we didn't know specifically, you kind of just assumed that there would be a package deal, Fletcher and Flair, that is, because of their history going back to in Minnesota. But maybe that's not the case. And I think that now we're starting to see, along with Ian LaPerriere, who deserves credit on his own, that maybe Brent Flair, who oversees the amateur draft, had something here, and he has a good idea of what this team needs. So couple that with Ian LaPerriere, who I think has done a nice job down there, and you've seen a Lehigh Valley Phantoms team. And Dan, you could speak to this better than me. And I've also deferred to Dan Esch, a former O&B Puckcast alumni as well, because he's a season ticket holder down there. I defer to you guys, and you've been a prospect aficionado for the last decade or so. That's probably the best team in Lehigh that we've seen going back to 2017, when you had the likes of Phil Myers down there and Nick Aubé-Kubel. So, I mean, it is very encouraging to see, and specifically from Ian LaPerriere.
Yeah, I definitely agree that the Phantoms are in the best position they've been in a while. They've got a good team down there. You know, with the drafting, at least in terms of what he's done here, Flair, you know, because usually the assistant GM has more control over drafting than the GM. It's really the rare circumstance where a GM will overrule. You know, we've talked about the Nolan Patrick thing where the intel I have is that Hextall overruled his scouts with Nolan Patrick, but it rarely seems to happen.
Well, didn't you mention also the Pasternak-Sanheim
yes,
stuff?
I also heard from somebody who knew the scouts in the room that the Flyers scouts wanted to take David Pasternak, and Hextall went over, and Hextall said, "We're taking Travis Sanheim." I believe that was Hextall's first draft pick. Flyers.
You're right.
So I'm sure he wanted to put his mark on that. But yes, I've heard that that's true. I mean, we need to be a little careful, right? And I keep that in mind about the what ifs, but the Patrick one for sure. And I've heard the same thing about the Sanheim one. You know, I'm sure that Brent Flair was not in favor of trading away the first round pick for Rasmus Ristolainen. And it's funny. I just went back today. I was bored and I looked at the picks because Buffalo took Isaac Rosen with that pick, who's a big forward, who's been okay and has been a decent prospect. But I wanted to see who was kind of taken after that. And in the next 10 picks, there were some really, like Wyatt Johnston, who's already one of the best young players in the NHL, was taken a few picks after the Flyers pick that they traded away. Jesper Wallstedt, who's bar none the best goalie prospect in the league, was taken. And you talk about maybe being able to trade a Carter Hart this offseason, which, I'm still skeptical they will do, even though I think it might be a good idea. If they had a guy like Jesper Wallstedt in the system, you could either trade Hart or Wallstedt and you would get a ransom's return. So, but anyway, that's off the topic. Looking at their draft picks, I still think that probably Caulfield over York was probably the better decision. That we still don't know. Bobby Brink taken in the second round that year. He's coming off of an injury, so you really can't read too much of it in this year. And his stats have been okay. I have not watched the Phantoms a whole lot this year, but people whose opinions I respect that have watched the Phantoms have told me that even though his stats are decent, that Bobby Brink has not been that great.
He's been in and out. He hasn't really been that impressive.
So I think that
and Boldy, if I could just insert, and Boldy was a guy I liked as well.
Was he available at that spot?
Yeah, I think he was. Remember, we traded down at that point. And
if they passed on Matt Boldy in that spot, which they may have, I probably blocked that out because I was.
Well, if I'm not mistaken, they could have taken him at 11.
Right. And then
where
they traded
the Coyotes took Soderstrom. They traded back to 14, I believe.
Yeah, to 14.
And so I think Boldy went 12 or 13.
That's right. That's a pretty big miss. And then you look at the rest of that draft, like the Ronnie Attard, Millman and the later round guys, none of them really look like they're going to be big contributors. The next year, Forster in the first round obviously looks like that's going to pan out. And Andre in the second round. I mean, he's one of my favorite prospects in the system. He's somewhat smaller defenseman, but man, he plays like a pit bull. He's good offensively. He's good defensively. I've heard that so far LaPerriere is extremely impressed with him. So I really like Andre. So those two picks in 2020, very good. And Desnoyers, they took in the 5th round, man. That draft, they only took 5 guys in that draft, but that one could be a really good one. 2021, they traded away the first round pick. That was the Risto. And then they took Samo Tuomala in the second round, who, to be fair to them, is a high upside.
It was a big swing. Might as well take a big
swing. And it doesn't look like that's going to work out. But they took Alexei Kolosov in the 3rd round, who is far and away the best young goalie in the Russian league in the KHL. He's the only under 21-year-old goalie in the KHL that played more than 10 games, and he played like 40 this year with good stats. So he's a really good goalie prospect. No one else from that draft really looks that great. So the 2021 draft, I don't know about.
And it's a weird draft, right? Because that's when everyone was scouted over video. And I remember talking to Charlie O'Connor about this actually. And Tuomala, obviously, it's looking like a dud right now. But the guy who went right after him was Logan Stankoven. The Dallas Stars, who looks really good. But Charlie said something very educated here. So I'll give him credit where he said, yes, it's looking bad. But given the world at that time, given how you were scouting, and given the philosophy behind taking Tuomala, you don't want to give up that philosophy. We criticize Ron Hextall for always not taking a big swing on the high level, on the high skill, high upside guys. And that was the Tuomala pick. So, it sucks because Stankoven went directly after him to the Dallas Stars, but it's one bad pick that I could overtly say, like, that's a very bad pick. And given the circumstances, COVID, scouting over video, whatever, I tend to give them a pass.
Well, I'll say this though, but just what was that necessarily kind of like a knee-jerk response to, hey, we should have people think we should have gone for Caulfield and gone for the big-time player at that point, but we didn't. We thought we kind of outsmarted it maybe by getting York and getting Brink, a player we liked, but now we're going to swing big on a second rounder. But the first rounder and the second round, it's hard to compare.
It's a fair point, and I remember talking to another GM about this, like from a Western Conference team, and I asked about Caulfield, and he said, like, look, there were 14 teams who passed on him. And he quoted a scout that he used to talk to about how you can work on a player's game, but you can't work on a player's size if they're small. And that's unfortunately just a thing in the NHL that unfortunately teams are very reserved when it comes to small players. And even if you look at Alex DeBrincat, who Caulfield has been compared to the most, he was a second round pick. So you could say like, okay, we took a first round pick on a guy that where you're confident in his size and everything. And then we took a swing on the second round guy. And I do think York, like, I mean, there's people in that organization, and I don't think it's crazy to say, that say he's been their best defenseman this year, going from right to left to right to left, up and down from the AHL. So, I mean, all in all, was it like the worst thing in the world? Probably not. So, like, but obviously you could make the case that they need goal scoring. But I do think Cam York was still a very good selection. But and especially if he becomes like a top pairing defenseman who could play either side, that's crazy. It's so beneficial to have, kind of like maybe you won't get to this level, but like Heiskanen could do that, switch from side to side. And for a team like the Flyers, who have been battling to find consistency on that right side for as long as they have, I could understand why they may still see that pick as a success.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's hard to find a defenseman who is pretty good defensively and also can be your top pairing power play guy, your number one power play quarterback. So if York becomes that guy, you can certainly argue that he'll be more valuable than a goal scoring winger like Cole Caulfield. So I don't really have a huge issue with that one. Although Boldy looks like he's going to be a pretty good 1C in the NHL. But
if they had kept that 11,
he's like a Kachuk light, and maybe not even light, right?
Then you look at you look at the draft this past year, and I've my opinion known on. I think they should have taken David Jiricek over Cutter Gauthier. Gauthier is going to be a pretty damn good player. So so it's hard to criticize that too much. I just think that Jiricek looks like he could be a franchise top pairing defenseman who plays physically like a Chris Pronger, but also can add in some offense. I'm not saying he's going to be as good as Pronger. Really, no one is. But
no, Pietrangelo, though, that's a guy that comes to mind.
He looks like a Pietrangelo. But what's really interesting from the draft last year is that the guy they took in the third round, Devin Kaplan, looks like he could be a really good player. So, I think that their drafting has probably been slightly above average when you look at how good the 2020 draft looks with Forster, Andre, and Denoyer, and Wisdom may contribute sometimes. So anyway, we've probably spent enough time talking about those items. But I've been okay with their drafting.
Yeah, I just a little credit also to Riley Armstrong and Jason Smith. I wanted to mention that those are the coaches this year at Lehigh Valley, and I'm guessing they've had their share of positive contributions if we're going to talk about what's been going on down there. And hopefully, if McCauley is the guy, he ends up being the right choice. But gents, we are burying the lead. I mean, one of the reasons I wanted to do the show was the big thing happened. In the beginning of the week, we noticed at the Flyers Carnival, a nice relaxed atmosphere since, Chuck Fletcher had been fired. It was Dan Hilferty, that was lurking around. We didn't see Dave Scott. And then on Monday, it's announced that Dave Scott is going to be retiring. I think he's April 17th. Hilferty is going to take over. And then something else happens in July, and that'll be it. I guess Dave Scott will be in for his gold watch. Yeah. And that's it. You have a new team. But that begs the question. Which, if the questions about Hilferty and Scott have been settled, and maybe McCauley's being hired, and the thing that doesn't make sense, and this is out of phase for me, and a little scattershot to gents, feel free to help me. Does it make sense that you would want to hire your president of hockey operations first before you hire your GM and start making moves like possibly Alan McCauley and things like that? I mean, yeah.
Like I could actually touch base on this because I had a conversation pertaining to this thing earlier today. I've been told, and I'm pretty confident of this based on the quality of the source, that Danny Briere offered to Dan Hilferty that he would take the president of hockey ops role. He said, whichever position you want me to take, I will take it. So I think Briere, who, in my opinion, based on my understanding of his close relationship with Comcast people, I think there's a case to be made that he would be the best choice. Like, he seems like a guy, and I've heard this from several people, that they believe can bring both sides together, a fractured relationship. And I think it's the Comcast people who want him to get a chance at building the team, which, okay, fine. I understand that. But if Danny Briere's the guy ultimately making all these big time decisions and building his staff, are you going to bring in a president to basically just be a figurehead? And you don't want that, right? Like, I've heard that Ray Shero is a guy that is near the top of his list. I've reached out to both the Flyers and the Minnesota Wild. Neither side are confirming that at this point. So, I mean, and one thing I've heard, but this is secondhand, so take it with a grain of salt, more like grapevine stuff. But I think Shero his reservation about coming to the Flyers is knowing that he probably won't have full say on hockey ops. And he looks at New Jersey and the success they're having, a team that his fingerprints are all over, and says, oh, maybe I could get a good chance at this, at getting another job of building a team and having full say on hockey ops. So I do think it's a little interesting that Danny Briere has so much say, but I'm not surprised. I knew that they were eventually going to give him the keys to the kingdom. I'm more surprised that he's offered to take over hockey ops and that they want him to stay as GM, but he also has a lot of say on how this thing is going to go. So, I mean, it feels like Briere has the keys to the kingdom and he's willing to take over president of hockey ops, but they want him as GM, which, to your point, Isaiah, is kind of looking like putting the cart before the horse.
Yeah, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, Anthony's closer to the situation than I am. It makes sense what he's talking about. And the way that they've all described Briere as, because of the roles that he's had in the organization, that he's naturally closer to the Comcast folks than Fletcher was, than most people would be. That role sounds like, because, they've talked about how they want the GM building the team and sort of managing down, right? And then they want the president managing up, controlling, disseminating information to the Comcast folks, controlling that kind of stuff. And so based on what we know about Briere, the president role almost seems like it would make more sense. However, I'm guessing that he also wants to have a heavy hand in the construction of this team. So it's almost, what's interesting is you almost would think that the perfect role would be Briere as president, John Tortorella as GM, and someone else as coach. Like that. And I don't know if that kind of GM role would sort Tortorella, but it sure does seem like he's talked about from when he took over about how one of his goals here is figuring out who's going to be part of this moving forward and who's not going to be. Yeah, that's the role of a coach to do, but that's also the role that the GM does. It's been interesting watching Tortorella's press conferences because I try and watch all of them. And it's sometimes he would defer to Chuck about player personnel decisions, but at the same time that he's talking about how he needs to figure out who's going to be part of this moving forward. Well, you can't have it both ways. And it seems to me like he wants a lot of control. He's very quick to say that he doesn't have that control, but he knows that he does. So that's kind of, that he's almost more in like a GM role and Briere is more of like a president role. I don't know. Anthony, what do you get to the dynamic between Tortorella and Briere?
I think Danny Briere was a huge proponent of John Tortorella. Like, I'm sure you guys remember going back to last June that myself and Anthony Sanfilippo kind of had conflicting reports on how the hiring went down. And I think that ASF was right in the sense that maybe Chuck Fletcher wasn't the biggest fan of John Tortorella, or maybe that it wasn't his first choice. But I think that there was a lot of people in hockey ops who were backing John Tortorella. And I think one of those people was Danny Briere. So I think that the dynamic between the two is just fine. I think this is something that maybe even and I can't speak to this. This is more just speculation. I think this is maybe something that John Tortorella was hoping for. Like, I had heard that when John Tortorella showed up entering this season, there still wasn't really a plan in terms of, are they going to rebuild? They were waiting for Torts to kind of tell them like what the F is going on in there. And I've heard that Chuck and both Dave Scott had very unassertive personalities. So when Torts basically started saying in early December, just like, yeah, this is a rebuild, it kind of like shoved them in that direction. And I think that, you've seen a lot of people today in response to my tweet, just like, oh, well, no changes, in-house hiring, all this. When you look at the organizational restructuring that was needed, I don't even think it was so much about personnel. I think it was more about structure. I think that the two people that had the biggest say in hockey ops had relatively delusional visions. And I think that Dave Scott was the first one who got way too hung up on 2019-20 and brought in Chuck Fletcher to be and I know I'm kind of going off track here from the Briere Torts question, but he had this delusional vision that 1920 wasn't an exception or an anomaly. He thought that was the team. And Chuck Fletcher had always felt pressure to deliver that because I'm sure you guys remember when he got brought in, bias for action.
Yeah.
So I think that Chuck Fletcher and Tortorella maybe had a disconnect because Chuck Fletcher was dealing directly with Dave Scott. And now that Briere has come in and Dave Scott's gone, and there's going to be another buffer, and Dan Hilferty's brand new on the scene, and Comcast trusts Briere so much that he somewhat has free reign here. And John Tortorella is clearly in lockstep with that. And Briere was a huge proponent of John Tortorella. It feels like one of the first times that everyone is starting to get on the same page. And I think that's why you maybe saw LA Vigneault so checked out after when he started last season with the team, because AV, like, look, the end of his tenure wasn't good, but I think he knew what he was dealing with here. And that's why he checked out. Like, AV's not a dumb guy. And I think that's why maybe he checked out so fast.
Well, I mean, it's obvious dysfunction. The concern, as I originally brought up, is that they're going to repeat the same cycle. And that, and Marcus Hayes had an article, which I don't think painted a completely accurate picture of things. But one of the words that was used to describe Danny in the article was like interloper. Well, won't the president of hockey operations, if he has a very strong opinion, be just that? Or he'll just be a yes man? Danny really should take the president of hockey ops job.
I would agree.
Go ahead, Anthony.
No, go ahead, Dan.
I wanted to bring up something from John Tortorella's press conference today that I found a little bit interesting, because one of the things we haven't talked about at all during this podcast is the role of the senior advisors, Bobby Clark, Paul Holmgren, and Bill Barber. A lot has been made of the fact that Bill Barber was always by Dave Scott's side. People think that, Bobby Clark and Paul Holmgren maybe have too much say over things. There's been some explosive. I mean, Charlie wrote an article that he then later clarified, talking about how basically those guys need to go and not be involved, and they can't hire anyone that's been associated with the Flyers. And then Chris Terrian on the Snow the Goalie podcast, called the article weak ass shit and was going off about how Holmgren and Clark and Barber have no say. And then, of course, Anthony Sanfilippo said, well, Chris, you're saying they didn't have anything to do with the hiring of Chuck Fletcher? And then Chris had to be like, well, yeah, I guess they sort of were involved in that. Anyway, and it seems like we're headed in the direction that those guys will not have as much of a say or any say moving forward. But today in Tortorella's press conference, he was talking about some of the things when he first came here that he knew that there's going to be work to be done on the player side. But what he didn't realize was how screwed up basically things were on the non-player side, and about how there were all these opinions out there and basically too many cooks in the kitchen, and people need to stay in their lanes. And he may have not been talking about the senior advisors, but that was my first thought, that John Tortorella has maybe seen Holmgren and Clark and these guys having a little bit too much say, and he's saying to himself, what the hell is going on? I could be completely wrong, and maybe Anthony knows a little more about that. But when Tortorella said that in his comments today about people staying in their lanes, that was my first thought.
Well, I think it's certainly a valid point. I think that another thing is about, kind of like the whole GM of Lehigh. Like, that's maybe just a microcosm of how the team has been run right now, that there's so much unclarity on whose specific role is what. Like, okay, it's Brent's role when he's there, but when he's not there, it's Chuck's, and now it's Danny's, but now Danny has to over. So I do think that it's kind of a microcosm that there isn't a proper structure of the organization. In terms of the senior advisors, like obviously Chris Terrier probably could speak on it better than anyone, including myself, because he was a player during the tenure of those guys and was an employee of the team as a media guy. But the best hypothesis that I could come up with, and it's nothing more than a hypothesis, is that, well, I've heard some stuff about it, but mainly a hypothesis, is that they were leaned on for big decisions more than they should have been because Dave Scott was the ultimate decision maker on hockey ops and shouldn't have been in that role. If you want to keep those guys around, and as you know, Chris Terrier said, like they should be able to walk into Voorhees or the Wells Fargo Center whenever they want. I agree, for sure. I think they've done enough as players, as coaches, as executives to warrant that. But I also think you need a guy in charge of hockey ops that could tell them thanks, but no thanks. I think you need to have a guy in there that could be like, okay, thanks, Paul, thanks, Bill, thanks, Dean, thanks, Bob, but we're going to do it like this. And I think that Dave Scott couldn't do that. I think Dave Scott would be like, okay, they say this, so we're going to do that. And I think that Chuck Fletcher, who was hired in large part because of Bob Clark's friendship with his dad, Cliff Fletcher, kind of was just like, okay, so these guys think that we need to rebuild, or we don't need to rebuild, rather, and we need to be competitive. So that's what I got to do, because that's the marching orders from up front. And that's why I've always kind of been hesitant to dump it all on Chuck Fletcher. He wasn't a good GM. He failed, needed to be fired for sure. But I also think he was given somewhat delusional marching orders, and they overloaded his plate. Like, he should have never been reporting directly to Dave Scott 6 months after coming on the job as GM. And then at times, as I learned today, playing GM role for the Phantoms. I think that Chuck Fletcher is probably still a heavily mediocre GM, a decent hockey guy, but they just gave him the keys to the kingdom way too fast. And then post Ron Hextall and post Paul Holmgren retirement, Dave Scott stepped in, and we didn't know who Dave Scott was during the Ron Hextall era when Paul Holmgren was president. We never heard about this guy. We knew he was there. Maybe we could pick him out of a line depending on what day it was. But I think that the overall structure of this team and Dave Scott having the final say and leaning so much on these advisors was the issue. So, I mean, maybe those guys could stick around. I don't blame them at all. Like, if they are asked their opinion, they're going to give it, and their opinion is their opinion. They're entitled to it. But I think the main issue here was at the very top, where Dave Scott, in terms of hockey, maybe couldn't think for himself.
You know, one of the things that Chris Terrian ranted about on one of the recent shows, which I completely agree with, it's one of my biggest pet peeves of what's going on right now here, is he said if he had been in the room when whoever was discussing giving Travis Sanheim an 8-year extension, he would have gotten up and basically threw a temper tantrum. Like, what do you guys do? Why would we do this? Why are we doing this? And he said, basically, anyone who was in that room and didn't say anything shouldn't be part of this organization moving forward. I feel the same way. And now with all that's, going on and what's been happening, I find myself wondering, like, whose choice was it? And I'd reached out to one of my good sources with the Flyers and was asking about the Sanheim extension. And the person basically said to me, well, after Sanheim, won the Ashby Award as the team's best defenseman, it was basically a given that he was going to be given a long contract. And I'm thinking to myself, what sense does that? Who thinks that way? Like, this guy had a good year. He won our best defenseman award. He's going to get a long contract. Like, how are they not? And this was after they hired John Tortorella that they handed out this contract. John Tortorella comes in and he says, yeah, one of my main goals is evaluating who's going to be part of this moving forward. And then the front office hands out an 8-year contract to this guy that anyone could see probably wasn't going to be a sort of Torts kind of guy. It's like mind-numbing to me.
Yeah, no, and it's a fair point. And, Travis Sanheim's a guy that I've heard Tortorella thinks doesn't step up when the games matter most. And if you think about it, when has Sanheim played the best? When they're in garbage time and they don't matter. Because you go back to 2020 in the bubble playoffs, disaster, along with Phil Myers. So I agree with you. And, I think that contract will age decently, because 6.25 for a player that Travis Sanheim presumably is on the regular is okay. But I agree with you, Dan. It made no sense. It was a terrible re-signing. John Tortorella clearly doesn't think too highly of him. And, you know, you look at now a guy like Ivan Provorov, who obviously has been kind of in the limelight because of his antics for Pride Night and because we've heard, and I think it's pretty accurate, that he's somewhat of a pariah in that room. But from an on-ice perspective, John Tortorella leans on Ivan Provorov a lot. And I've heard that John Tortorella respects the hell out of Ivan Provorov because he comes to play every night. He's always available. He competes. They feel he's still a very good defender. Obviously, we know what his decision-making with the puck is, but, you know, he's always competing. He eats the toughest PK minutes. And, like, if you're looking at this team next year and going forward, who would you rather have, Provorov or Sanheim? I would say Ivan Provorov. But they've kind of now shoehorned themselves into a corner where it's almost like if you have to pick between the two, you have to pick Sanheim to stick with because of the contractual issues. So Provorov, I know I was told most likely he'll be back next year. I don't know if that's trying to negotiate through the media. I know that they'll definitely listen on him like they will with every player. But if you're locked and loaded with Travis Sanheim for the foreseeable future here, and you don't have an in-house replacement for Ivan Provorov to take on those PK minutes, you're going to be in a bit of a jam here. And we know Provorov has not been great for the last 2-3 regular seasons. We get that. But I think we could all agree here that, you know, pound for pound, Provorov's the better defenseman. And his contract is only for 2 more years as opposed to Sanheim, who's another 8. You haven't even started here yet. So, I mean, it was very befuddling that they locked in Travis Sanheim, but I think that speaks to the point that I said earlier, that they didn't even know entering the season if they were going to rebuild.
That's what happens when you have no plan. I think the thing, it's crystal clear now, whether you or I or whoever likes Ivan Provorov, the most important person to like Ivan Provorov is John Tortorella. And it's clear. Prov is his guy on defense. And he had to take the personnel that he has right now and start in a pecking order. He would pick Provy first. It's not even a competition.
And well, just to speak to that point quickly, is like Tortorella has not been afraid to call out his players in the media, right? He has not been afraid to. And when that Pride Night stuff went down, he used himself as a human shield to defend Provorov. So whether or not Provorov's liked in that room by the other players, it's clear that John Tortorella is a massive proponent of Ivan Provorov. And forget his words, his actions speak to that as well.
Well, the reality is, I've got a couple things on this. The reality is who else could a coach rely on that decor? Like, exactly. D'Angelo can't play defense. Cam York is good, but he's young. He doesn't look to me like a guy who you'd want to rely on for heavy minutes, especially heavy minutes like big defensive zone play. Sanheim's like a wet rag, basically. You know, Ristolainen is okay, but he's not a top pair minutes eater. I mean, maybe
he's a 4.
Into that.
He's a 4.
Yeah, but Provorov's really the only guy, right? So like, and this is what I was gonna ask Anthony is, this is sort of totally unrelated. It's because, you know, Anthony's become kind of like an insider. Like we said, he's breaking stories. You said something there because you wrote a story, and part of it, you mentioned that you'd heard that Provorov was likely going to be back next year. And you just said that, you know, maybe you were told that to put it out there as a negotiating thing. And I've heard from other people close to the organization that think that he might be gone. But it's interesting as you get, this is more of a question about, you know, being a reporter. As you get, you know, better and better sources, you're clearly aware of the fact that I guess sometimes they might tell you things because they know it's going to get out and it can sway, you know, people negotiating through you. That's sort of an interesting dynamic, right? I guess you have to get comfortable, like sometimes putting things out there that people are telling you that, you know, might actually be the reverse of what's going on. How's that dynamic been for you? I'm curious.
Well, it's been a learning curve for sure. Like, obviously I've gotten more and more comfortable with better sources. And, you know, like there's some guys I'm super comfortable with. There's some guys like I'm kind of still like, oh, should I text him at this time? Whatever. And there's other guys who text me at 1 a.m., you know? So I think that in a situation like Provorov, particularly, is that I don't think it's a coincidence that I was told that after Jacob Chikrin got traded for what was a very underwhelming return, and that everyone and their grandmother knew that the Coyotes were trying to trade Jacob Chikrin for, 17, 18 months. So maybe the person that leaked it to me that he'll most likely be back next year, and then also followed it up with saying he's a player that's hard to get fair value for, is trying for me to put it out there so other teams are just like, okay, well, they're not actively trying to trade him like Bill Armstrong and the Coyotes were trying to do with Jacob Chikrin. So if we want to get him, we're going to have to pay a premium. And you have to kind of read between the lines. You have to kind of preface stuff with your own thoughts as well. And I think that may be a situation, because all I've heard, and all you guys have heard, this isn't breaking news or anything, is that he is a very big pariah in that room. He's a guy that isn't necessarily well liked. He's a guy that has been underwhelming since the 2020 playoff bubble, where I would argue, aside from Carter Hart, was their team MVP. And he's a guy that I think is an ultra uber competitor that would probably welcome a change to a competitive team. But at the same time, you look at it objectively and you're saying, okay, so we're going to trade Provorov, let's say based on what Chikrin got, let's say a first and a third round pick, right? Let's say because Chikrin's a younger, superior player, whatever. We get a first and a third round pick for him. You get no body back. And now you have to make up 24 minutes of ice time, 3 minutes on the man advantage, down a man rather, per game. And who's going to be taking on those minutes? Is it Cam York? I think he's playing like 30 seconds per game down a man. Are you going to give that to Travis Sanheim? Well, we know how Tortorella thinks about him. I think you finally unlocked Rasmus Ristolainen as whether or not you feel bad about the way that they re-signed him and what they gave up to him. I think he's finally lived up to what maybe they saw as an all defense, low event, second pair, number 4 defenseman. But what happens if you elevate his role on the top pair with Cam York? And I think the slotting and the overall outlook of that defense really kind of looks ugly if Ivan Provorov gets taken off of it. And then it's just like,
okay, but let me interject here.
If
you're committed to a rebuild, is this really as big an issue as it might have been with the vantage point or the attitude that you were coming into it with about 4 months ago, when we were still thinking,
That's a very fair point. But the thing I've heard is they don't want to make the same mistake as they made with Provorov and Sanheim and Gostisbehere, or they don't want to make that same mistake with Cam York and Igor Zamula and Emil Andre, in the sense that, like, they don't want these guys to eat these heavy minutes and play with Andrew McDonald. They want someone to play with them to bring them along. So let's say you trade Provorov for a first and third round pick. What's your first pair next year? Because to me, off the top of my head, it's either Sanheim with York on the right or York and Rasmus Ristolainen. Both to me sound terrible in the way of developing Cam York. And that's the issue that I think they're running into here, is that you saw the damage that happened with Ivan Provorov specifically as a guy that with the right partner, he was maybe sniffing me a top 10 defenseman in the NHL. You take that partner away and he's maybe had irreparable damage done to his game, where maybe now he's a number 2, number 3 on a cup contender. That's where I think that they see the issue, is that they don't want to overload specifically Cam York, who would presumably be their number 1 defenseman if Provorov left, with unbearable matchups and partners that shouldn't be on a top pair.
I think with all the trades and one of the things you were talking about, and interesting, just to kind of pivot, and I think we can bridge that Provorov issue, is when you put something out there about Cam Atkinson, should he be a buyout candidate? And you get a like from the official account of Cam Atkinson. Okay.
Unfortunate.
In case if people miss that. But if they're going to have opportunities to clear contract, whether it's Hayes, Provorov, or Atkinson, in other words, they could be players in like the mid-tier of free agency to get someone who's a little bit better than a Band-Aid to fill that role, because they think Provorov can bring them somebody that let's just say, for example, and again, it's all relevant. Morgan Frost coming on, looking more and more like a 50 to 60 point player now than he has at any time in his career. now like a Frost and a Provorov, and maybe the LA Kings are thinking, you know what? Frost is good enough, and Provorov could be an heir apparent to Drew Doughty when Doughty finally retires. Meanwhile, we get to take a run of the cup. We get a young center. You know what? Maybe we will let go of Byfield. So in other words, things open up if you're willing to have that kind of flexibility. Or maybe I'm just talking nonsense. I don't know.
No, but like if said deal would, like I had heard, and I think Anthony Sanfilippo mentioned this as well, is that LA called on Provorov and they said, we want Byfield. And then LA basically said kick rocks. So I don't get this misconstrued. If a team steps up with a good value for Ivan Provorov, they will move him. I would almost, and this is more speculation, I would almost lean that they would prefer to move him because I just think that he's a guy that makes sense and could get value. I just think that they're very much in the thought process of just like, if we move on from Provorov and then we give Cam York nobody to play with, I think that's the issue they run to. And with the Cam Atkinson stuff, it's the second time I suggest a buyout and Cam likes it. And I feel really terrible about it because I love Cam Atkinson as a player. And I think for his AAV, he's more than worth $5.8 million. For me, it's more of a positional thing. I asked about that today. I get the sense that there's no appetite to exercise a buyout because they feel like a Tippett could move to the left side, or maybe a Bobby Brink if he makes the team. So I don't think they're going to buy out Cam Atkinson by any stretch. That was just my speculation and what I would do. And I'm sorry that Cam liked it. Whatever. It's fine. He doesn't really care about me. I'm sure he was just doing it to troll me, and mission accomplished. But I do think that not by any stretch that Provorov is untouchable. If they could get value, they will roll the dice. I just don't think that Briere and company want to move him just for the sake of moving him and then risk the Cam York getting the same Provorov treatment. And in respect to Morgan Frost, I asked about him today. I was told that they're going to bring him back. They see him as a part of the future, at least in the midterm. If they win the lottery and they draft Connor Bedard, maybe things change because then it's just like, well, where does he fit? And then, like to your point, Isaiah, you could probably get a decent value for him because of the player that he's become. Pending RFA, you can kind of control his contract. But I do think that assuming they don't win the lottery and they draft in that 6 to 8 range, Morgan Frost is going to be back next year. And I think he's earned that. Do I think it should be a mega long-term deal? Probably not, but I think he's going to get a bridge deal, and good for him. You know, he's finally gone a whole season without major injuries. He's finally got a whole season without COVID interruptions. He's finally got a whole season with a coach that gave him the necessary rope, with tough love along the way for sure. But I think John Tortorella has said to everyone that even if I throw you down a ditch, and I heard this analogy from someone with the Flyers, he'll always throw you a ladder to see if you can climb out of that. And I think Morgan Frost has done that, and he deserves all the credit in the world.
So I want to talk about Frost for a little bit because
of course you do.
No, because
I'm kidding.
This whole thing has been really interesting to follow, and I've gotten some insight from different people around the organization. Tortorella has been very hard on Frost all year long, and to the point where, you watching these press conferences, especially the first half of the year, you would think to yourself, he doesn't want this guy on the team. Like he's been very clear in his effusive praise of guys like Cates, Tippett. Man, he loves Tyson Forster. Forster's not even on the team anymore, and he finds ways of bringing him up, like he did today in the press conference about, we just sent some really good guys down to Lehigh Valley. What my understanding is that Torts is still not sold on Frost, that he was not sold on from the start. And part of it is that Chuck Fletcher, Brent Flair, and Danny Briere have basically been telling Torts from the start about how skilled Frost is, how big a part of this franchise Frost can be, and sort of shoving Frost down Torts' throat. And Torts' initial reactions to Frost were not positive. And that this has actually been one of the kind of like banging heads between those guys that, Torts and Briere probably agree on a lot of stuff. But, Frost and Charlie O'Connor wrote about this a little bit in his article today, because he asked Frost about Frost and Briere have developed a friendship, and Briere probably sees a little bit of himself in Frost. They both wear 48. They're both smaller, skilled players. it took Briere a little while to figure it out in the NHL. And so he kind of naturally gravitated towards Frost, and Frost gravitated towards him. And I think they've struck up sort of a relationship, and Briere's tried to help him figure it out and gain some confidence. And Charlie asked Frost if now that Briere is the GM, does it make him more comfortable that he's going to be part of this moving forward? And Frost answered the question correctly. He said, no, it doesn't make me feel that way. You know, friendships are one thing, but at the end of the day, it's all business. The reality is, though, is that I think Briere is a pretty big fan of Morgan Frost. And I think that John Tortorella maybe still is not convinced that Frost is a part of this moving forward. But with Briere here and Flair, who's a big fan of Frost, that he's definitely going to be back. And I don't think it's because of Torch's opinion of him. I think it's because of Briere's opinion of him and Flair. So as I understand, that's sort of like one of those areas of disagreement between them. However, I do think that Frost is probably winning over towards some. Charlie's article talked about how since Briere has taken over as interim GM, you can tell that Torts is talking about Frost differently, which again goes back to the fact that now Briere's in charge and Torts knows how Briere feels about him. But I still think, all of that said, that Torts probably does agree that Frost has been playing a lot better recently. Look, a guy like Owen Tippett, probably because of all the ice time he's been getting, he's been pretty damn bad the last 3 games. Like, Tippett had a turnover in the game two games ago against the Red Wings that led to a turnover in his own zone that led to a breakaway where Hart made a really good glove save. And I'm thinking to myself as I'm watching that, if this was Morgan Frost, he'd be probably like benched for a little bit. Maybe not. Maybe that's not being fair to Torts. But these young kids go through ups and downs. Frost has been a lot better recently, and I think that Torts is kind of seeing that. I still don't know what the ultimate upside is with Frost, but I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about that dynamic, that Frost has big fans in the front office. And so even though Torts maybe doesn't feel that way, which I don't think he's a huge fan yet, he's still going to be around.
Yeah, I think also that Tippett has earned a little bit more rope, with some of his play. I mean, he's their zone entry guy, and his game has grown a lot. And I think he's fighting through something physically, though. I'm not sure. I think there's something there too, because he's missed some practice time. Yeah.
Sorry to jump in, but with Tippett, he's more of a shoot first player, but when he carries the puck, he has a lot of forecheck, I find.
Yeah.
Like the way he carries the puck and everything.
That's not a bad comparison.
Yeah. And with Morgan Frost, like, look, I've heard from people in the front office that they like his game. Like you said, Dan, there's a lot of skill there to like, but 2 things have been the issue with him. It's either it's confidence and it's consistency. And when you see a guy, let's say from Torts' perspective, you see him put on a show last night against Montreal, but he did it nonetheless, for sure. That goal he scored near the end of the game, you were just like, yeah, this guy's a player. And then there'd be some games, that I'm talking about more earlier in the season, not so much now where he's been on a really good stretch here, where he would be invisible. Not that he's playing bad. He's played very responsible hockey. I think he deserves all the credit in the world for like being a good, responsible center. But you'd be like, well, where is he? I can't pick him out. You look at the analytics, you're just like, hey, he was decent defensively. He wasn't a liability. But where is this guy? And I think it's frustrating for a coach when you're saying just like, why are you this one night and why are you this that night? And I think that earlier in the season, Frost's confidence was shook when he got sat against Toronto in his hometown. But you have to look at how players respond to being called out in the media and being healthy scratch. Like, look at a guy like Ristolainen. Even if you guys aren't fans of Ristolainen, how has he responded to Torts sitting him after 3 games and basically saying, yeah, we have to completely rebuild this guy? Take away the trade and the contract and the re-signing and all that, I think he's been a pretty good defenseman. Probably their best defensive defenseman this year, even by analytics. And I think for Frost, because I've learned that Tortorella does and says everything for a reason. And whether that's wrong or right, I think maybe with Frost, he was saying, okay, this is a guy that struggles with confidence. So instead of coddling him and babying him, we are going to send him right into the deep end and be like, you know what, bud, this is the way we want you to play. And if you can't hack this emotionally or through confidence, we don't need you here. And I think Frost, maybe it's taken him a roundabout way. maybe longer than we would have expected. But I think that maybe Tortorella, because one thing I've liked about Tortorella, and like I said earlier, people have told me this, is that he'll always throw you a ladder. And even when Frost was getting criticized, he would always get thrown a ladder. Like, okay, go out there on the first power play unit. Go out there with like the second or the first line. I think last night he started with Lemieux and I forget, but he ended up with Farabee and Tippett. So, I mean, maybe Torts is showing tough love because he knows that Frost's confidence needs to be hardened. And that's the old school in John Tortorella. But again, I weigh way more what a coach does as opposed to what they say. And I think Frost played almost 21 minutes last night. So even if he's not going to show, give him praise in the media, he's doing it through the deployment. And I think that maybe the lack of praise he's giving to Frost in the media is a tool to Frost to be like, look, you have to be able to be comfortable with your own game and be confident enough with your own game without getting constant praise from us, whether it be the coaches or the GM.
Yeah, we don't need to talk about this one, too much. I will say, though, one thing I heard about the Frost stuff was that there was a game early in the year, might have been close to that game where he was benched, where they put him on the fourth line. They put him on the fourth line, and with some guys, Delorier that clearly weren't the kind of guys that he's going to create offense with. And Torts got an earful from Fletcher. And so the part of giving, moving him up in the lineup and playing him where he's been playing him has been, hey, I'm going to give this guy the opportunity and we'll see what he's made of. But that it was almost like trying to prove to the front office guys that he wasn't going to cut it, So it'll be interesting to see what happens. I think one of the dynamics here is that moving forward, since they've got Noah Cates as a center, they don't have any probably other centers in the pipeline for next season other than Couturier, Cates, and Frost. So I think those are probably your, barring something changing, your three centers. But, if Gauthier ends up arriving here and they turn him into a center, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Because obviously Torts really likes Cates, and Frost is probably not a guy you'd want on your fourth line. So that'll be an interesting dynamic to see. And I still think that Frost has more upwards potential from an offensive perspective. I agree that he's got to be more consistent, and it is nice that he's been playing more of a 200-foot game. But, there's one of the interesting things that Torts also mentioned today that someone asked him about is, do you adjust the way that you analyze the play of these younger players and really all the players in general when the games don't mean as much? And Anthony talked about that with Sanheim. And you look at Frost, he's had 2 3-point games against the Coyotes, I think.
Yeah.
It's interesting because you could argue that this team hasn't played many meaningful games all season long, right? So how do you evaluate players when a lot of the times the teams you're playing against aren't taking you that seriously? So that's and Torts had an interesting answer, which was, was basically talking about how, yes, you do sort of have to take that into account. They will be playing the next number of games against teams, trying to get into the playoffs. But even then, I think that these teams will take you a little bit more lightly. And the Flyers don't play as many physical games against teams because when the games don't matter as much, teams tend to not play quite as hard. The reason the Flyers blow out a team like the Panthers is probably because it was the second of a back-to-back for the Panthers, and they maybe weren't taking the Flyers all that seriously. So it does kind of complicate things when you're trying to analyze players in games that aren't maybe as hard fought. And especially with a guy like Torts, who we know wants to see how players step up in big situations. Well, there haven't been that many big situations for this team this year.
No, it is tougher. And I talked about this last week, is that you got to be careful this time of year when guys show well, because it's garbage time. It's like September baseball and can be like fool's gold in a lot of ways. But I would give more credit and more credence to players that have been here all year, like Tippett and Frost and Cates, versus a guy like Forster. Everybody likes Forster, but is he that guy that we just saw last week over the last, 5, 6, 7 games? Just maybe put some perspective on that, because you can get fooled by that. That doesn't mean that he's not going to be here next year and compete. But again, you got to take that with a grain of salt. So yeah, I hear what you're saying. All you can do is compete against the best teams. The Flyers have 9 games after tonight, and they are going to play some teams that need to have points. Pittsburgh, you're going to be at Dallas, the Islanders. You're going to be, Boston doesn't need points right now.
Well, to build off what you just said, is that a guy that I think has maybe surprised some people, me specifically, is Brendan Lemieux. I think he's played decently. I think he's played well. And I've heard through the grapevine that he actually went, again, this is grapevine stuff. It's not a direct source, so take it with a grain of salt. But I've heard that he went into Torts' office and said that he wants to be part of the solution. And that's great. It's a great attitude and all that. But I've also heard that there's reservation from Torts and others that, is this just Brendan Lemieux playing for a new contract? Is it just Brendan Lemieux, being like a buddy of Tony DeAngelo? Is he going to get a 2-year contract and then mail it in and be a locker room cancer because of his past antics? So I think that speaks to your point, Isaiah, that you have to be reserved with guys who are doing this in a short sample size in garbage time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you bring him back, it's because maybe you think that, as I'd mentioned this last week, maybe Delorier gets tired of, sticking up for guys with a losing team going nowhere. And maybe by the end of next year, he wants to get traded. And if you have a guy like Lemieux in a 1-year, $800,000 contract, it makes it more plausible. And if you think about it, Lemieux actually has pretty good skill for a guy of his ilk. It's just he's been a butthead and a bad teammate at times,
I was just going to say real quick, who else had good skill for a guy of his ilk? Zach McEwen, the guy he was traded for. Yep. I mean, you've already got Delorier signed through 2026. You're really going to have him and Lemieux on the fourth line for the foreseeable future. I don't know if that's the fourth line you want. And I certainly don't want Brendan Lemieux on my third line. I don't think when you look at the amount of wing talent in this organization, I don't think Lemieux necessarily fits. I agree that maybe a 1-year contract for not much money, but I don't think he's part of the solution moving forward.
Yeah, with me, the only path I see Lemieux coming back would be if they decide to move on from Wade Allison. And that's been a weird case to me with Wade Allison. I like Allison. I think that he'll never be more than a third liner. I think at this point, given the team's overall depth on the right wing, he's probably a fourth liner. I put out a tweet yesterday, I think it was yesterday or the day before, that Delorier, Denway, Allison is a fourth line that I could see for next season. But we know that Torts, I believe he said it 9 times, he's always hurt in one of his latest press conferences. Yeah. So I'm really not sure the direction they're going with Allison. I don't think Lazinski is going to be part of the program moving forward, unfortunately for him. But Allison's a guy who I think everyone likes, but clearly Torts isn't the biggest fan, whether that means his lack of availability or just because of his play overall, or a combination of both.
I think, I've heard that when it comes to Allison, Wade thinks he has more skill than Torts does. And Wade thinks his game is being curtailed by what the north-south stuff, and that he could break out. Yeah, he has to stay healthy, but if he was given more of an opportunity, he has a skill set that translates more into kind of an F9-10, not 9-10, 6-7.
Like a Hartnell?
Yeah.
Okay, well, Dan, you were super big on the prospects while Wade was coming up. What do you think about?
He's always hurt. I mean, from a pure skill standpoint, I think if you could guarantee that the guy was going to play 80 games a year, I think that maybe you could see him with the skill of a Hartnell, but I don't think he has that skill, but maybe a poor man's Hartnell, and maybe
in that vicinity.
third liner, but I mean, the funny thing about him is he's got a really good shot, like a very good shot, but he in the NHL to this point, like Tyson Forster did a better job in 6 games of getting to his shot, as they call it, than Wade Allison. You watch those guys in practice, Wade Allison's got like a better shot than Tyson Forster. Like he's got a very hard, very accurate shot, but he's just not, he doesn't have the IQ. He's not good enough to get to his shot, quote unquote, to put himself in positions to use it. Whereas Torslov's talking about Forster's puck protection and his puck poise. And, there's a reason that Forster was a first-round pick and Allison was whatever, third-round pick. Second.
Yeah.
So he was taken fairly high, but it took a while to get to the NHL. Obviously, had the knee injuries. He's always hurt. I mean, maybe he's got third-line talent, but I agree. I don't think he's going to be here next year. I think they're going to move on from him. I think, and so they're going to move on from Lazinski.
Yeah, it's a shame. Listening to it's almost like he waited too long. He should have left college earlier because he was ready to be a pro. Because his ceiling was pretty low as it was, but his floor seemed pretty high. He's like really like a fourth liner right out of college, but it didn't work.
This offseason is going to be fascinating because, as we've said, they've now said multiple times that it's a rebuild, right? And that doesn't mean they're going to tear it down, which to me means that they're not going to trade guys like York and Tippett, even though he's older than most people think, because he's been around as a while as a prospect, but not going to trade him, not going to trade the younger prospects, Forster. But there were, things came out that Carter Hart might be available. So they basically said it's a rebuild, which if it's a rebuild, you would think that they would be moving the guys who don't fit the timeline, like a Konechny, like a Hart, like a Provorov. I just have a hard time believing that they're going to move a Konechny because of how much Tortorella loves him. As much as I think that trading Hart might be the best move as like a high risk move to try and hit a grand slam and then backfill with Ersson, who looks like he could be very good. And you've got Kolosov maybe coming over at some point. I just don't know if they would do that. Like it's going to be very interesting to see what they're going to do aside from the obvious, which is moving Kevin Hayes. Like they're clearly going to try and move Kevin Hayes. Kevin Hayes is the only player that got benched and responded the next night with, I thought, one of the worst games I've ever seen anyone play. He does not care at this point. Like Kevin Hayes and John Tortorella do not get along. That guy will not be here next year. I don't know what they're going to get for him, but other than that, I really wonder, even though they're saying it's a rebuild, what are they going to do? It's going to be a fascinating offseason.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I mean, the 3 players that are worth the most, there's a reason to keep all of them: TK, Hart, and Ivan Provorov. Yeah. So 2 other items. The Flyers have won 5 out of the last 6, which means that what are they in the draft lottery? I just did Tankathon. What are they, number 6?
So people are freaking out because they keep winning games. But the reality is that the teams right above them also continue to win games. So the Flyers are 7th. The teams, and they're pretty clearly in as 7th worst. The points per game percentage of Arizona, who's in 6th, is .893. The Flyers' points percentage is .759. Then there's 3 teams above them: Vancouver, Detroit, and St. Louis, who all have a 1,000 winning percentage. So, or 1 points per game. So there's only 9 games left. It's highly likely at this point that the Flyers are going to finish 7th worst. I don't think that they're going to, like, people are joking on Twitter, oh, who are the Flyers going to take with the 12th pick in the draft? Like, this is probably where they're going to finish, is 7th worst. And that'll give them a 6.5% chance at picking, 6.5% chance picking first, 6.5% chance picking second, 44% chance of picking 7th, 36% of 8th, and 5% at 9th. And the reality is that they're not as bad of a team. People are like, oh my God, we're blowing the tank. They're just not as bad of a team as Columbus, Chicago, San Jose, Anaheim, Montreal, Arizona. Like, they're not as bad as those teams. So this is where they're going to end up. I mean,
well, the other thing I mentioned is that Alex Appleyard today put out a tweet about who's likely to be available. And this is a really good year to need a center and not reach. He talked about guys like Leo Carlson, Benson. Is it Zach Benson?
Zach Benson. He's more of a left wing, but maybe also a center.
Okay. One guy named Smith, Moore, Leonard. I don't know the first names yet.
So real quick, obviously the top 4 picks are likely going to be Bedard, Adam Fantilli, Leo Carlson, and Matvei Michkov in some order, unless, as some people have speculated, the Russia factor makes Michkov slip. It will be very interesting if he lasts to the Flyers, if they take him or not. He's very talented. He might be the second most talented guy in the draft. Zach Benson, after 4, opinions start to kind of go in different directions. However, Benson has been so good the second half of the season that it seems likely that he might end up going 5. The thing for me is, and still some hockey to be played, but there's some good centers available. I don't really like, so the U.S. development players, there's 4 really good players on that team. Will Smith and Oliver Moore are the first 2 centers. I actually really like Oliver Moore. He looks kind of built out of the Logan Stankoven mold, except he's a better skater and maybe not quite as skilled. But I have this fear that, last year the Flyers took Gauthier instead of Jiricek. I have this fear that this year they're going to reach on a right-handed defenseman and take a David Reinbacher, who's pretty good, and forego taking a center. Or we'll see. The point you're making is correct. There's going to be some very good players available when the Flyers pick. We just have to hope that they might make the right selection.
That's it.
Yeah, well, I spoke to a scout outside the Flyers organization in recent days, and I asked about the whole Michkov thing, how he sees that playing out with his contractual obligation and commitment in Russia. And he thinks he's going to slide. He does say that he's firmly a top 2 talent and that pass on him at your own peril, I think was the phrase he used. But he thinks that teams are going to convince themselves with the convenience of taking someone over in North America over him. And the 2 players I asked about that he thinks teams will pass on Michkov for are Will Smith and Benson. So I think if the Flyers are at number 6, they will have a chance to take Michkov. Now, who knows, right? If a St. Louis winds up picking number 2, I think that's a team that will take Michkov, because that's a team that already is in a full rebuild. They have some young talent, so you could afford to wait on
Detroit, probably.
Yeah, exactly. But if it's Montreal, Columbus, San Jose, Arizona, those types of teams, I think you may see a situation where Michkov slips to the Flyers. And, I think they're going to get a very good player. I think that's a slam dunk. I do think they're going to go firmly best player available. I think Michkov, the belief is that I've heard they like Will Smith, but if that's the guy I've heard that they like, who knows? That's kind of hearsay at this point. But if Michkov would fall to them, it would be because Will Smith was already taken. I've had people tell me that he arguably has the best hockey IQ in the entire draft, tied with Leo Carlson.
Who, Michkov?
No, Will Smith.
Yeah, well, okay.
Yeah.
So you've had some good sources tell you that the Flyers are high on Will Smith?
No, that's grapevine stuff. That's grapevine stuff
Okay.
that I've heard about them being high on Will Smith. But I did have that one very good source tell me earlier today that if Michkov falls to them, that's because Will Smith has been taken, because there are a lot of teams that are really big believers in Will Smith's hockey IQ for whatever the reason.
So okay, got it. So that's from someone who's looking at the teams who pick 5 and 6 and thinking that those teams covet Will Smith.
Yeah, and the scout I spoke to from another organization said that he thinks that teams will reach on Smith and Benson to forego Michkov.
Okay, yeah,
I'm
asking those questions just because, and I could be completely wrong. I mean, these scouts, they make their living watching these players. I've watched some full games of Will Smith, and he's not a very good skater, and his compete level really falters at times. And I watch him and I think of guys like Kevin Hayes or
Yeah.
Chris Gratton. Like, I'm not a big fan of Will Smith, and I think the Flyers need to inject some speed in the lineup.
So you're saying Will Smith would be kind of like a slap in the face?
I know you've been waiting on that. Again, he could turn out into an incredible NHL player. My personal opinion is I'm not a huge fan of his. I really like some of the players. And if like Elite Prospects, which I think does a really good job with their draft guide, has him a little bit lower. And they actually have Oliver Moore as the fifth, as sixth in the draft, Benson 5 and Oliver Moore 6th in terms of prospects. But if Michkov slips to 7, if the Flyers end up 7, do you think that if he lasts to the Flyers, that they are the type of team that would be scared from taking him, or do you think that they might jump at the opportunity to get him?
No, I think they take him. Honestly, I think that what you've seen from the Flyers drafting philosophy since Brent Flair has got here, and I think Danny Briere shares this vision because he said as much when he had his introductory press conference to be the special assistant to the GM, not to the GM, but last year, and he mentioned high-end skill. I think that's one of the reasons why they took Cutter Gauthier last year, is because they said, okay, this is the guy who could arguably be the best prospect from an offensive perspective since probably Claude Giroux, unless I'm missing someone. Like, I think he had a higher offensive ceiling than even Couturier did, because Couturier was coming off of mono in the Quebec majors, if I'm not mistaken. And one thing about that, I've actually poked around about the whole Gauthier versus Juracek thing. And I've had several people say, like, just let Gauthier develop. Very high on Cutter Gauthier. And they said the thing that people have to realize here is that Juracek played pro in overseas last year, as opposed to Gauthier, who was in the U.S. National Development Program. So his path is going to be different. I still think either pick was good, but they took an upside pick. And I've had another GM who interviewed Gauthier prior to the draft tell me that Gauthier was the best interview and that teammates love him, captain material, all that. So I think the Flyers are very big on the upside picks here. And I think that's why they took Gauthier. And I think that if Michkov falls to them, they're going to take that as well. Because, you know, I was talking about this with someone with the Flyers the other day, and they laughed and said, yeah, you're absolutely right, that they have enough middle six forwards in terms of NHL caliber ceilings to fill out 2 teams. Like, you look at the guys that even Ron Hextall drafted, even Chuck Fletcher drafted, they have a lot of guys who have that type of ceiling, but you're going to run out of real estate in terms of where to put them. So I think the Flyers are very much in the mindset, and sometimes it's going to blow up in your face, like Tuamala over a Stankoven, but you don't want to lose that mindset. You want to take the big swings for those picks, even if sometimes it burns you. And that's why I think if Michkov were to fall for them, they would take that pick, because they could never get a better chance to get a guy of his skill.
No, it's like getting a chance at a number 2 pick all over again. And instead of blowing it, cashing in, see what happens. So, gents, I think we're going to wrap it there. Just wanted to mention before we go that just congratulations for 43 years of service to the Philadelphia Flyers for Steve Coates, who's retiring at the end of this year. Remember him from Coates's Corner. And, you know, Dan, you remember Coatesy more than, you know, Anthony. You didn't really grow up with Coatesy that much. I don't know what kind of feed you got, or whether you got the radio broadcast through Sirius or anything.
Oh, yeah. I grew up, you know, listening to Coatesy. I mean, just chock full of personality, just always smiling. I think it's going to be sad not having him around. Again, just a lot of personality, and, you know, loves the Philadelphia Flyers.
Yeah, it sounds like he's going out on his own terms, which is always good too. So,
yeah, my vantage point is obviously I grew up in Montreal. I live in Montreal. When I first started listening to the broadcast on NHL.com, it was actually Tim Saunders and Brian Propp, oddly enough, and then it switched to Chris Terrian. But from 2008 on, I used to pay for the NHL Center Ice package through Bell. So I would always get either back then it was Comcast Sportsnet Philadelphia, or the visitors or the opposing team's feed of Fox Sports, whatever. But yeah, Coates obviously has left a big impact on this organization, and good to see him get recognized.
Yeah, absolutely. Dan, any final thoughts before we call it a night?
No, I'm just, it's been fun to watch, even though, you know, you kind of wish they'd be sometimes losing to improve their chances of getting Connor Bedard. I got to tell you, it's been fun watching some of these young guys play, watching Forrester score incredible goals, like that rip he had.
Yeah.
I don't remember who it was against, but it's been fun watching them win games, watching these young kids develop. So we'll see. The season's coming to an end. We'll be heading to the draft. We're going to get a good player there. We'll see what happens. But I think the vibes around this franchise are a lot better than they were a month ago, and that's nice.
Yeah, absolutely. Anthony, you've come a long way since we last had you on, and just another congratulations on your success, and you continue to break stuff, including some things you talked about tonight. Any final thoughts before we call it a night from your perspective?
Well, thank you for the kind words. All I would say is that even though it may not be a bloodshedding in terms of player personnel or not player personnel, like just personnel in general in the organization that people were maybe expecting, myself included, I think that maybe just give them the benefit of the doubt for the immediate future, just because I think that the overall organizational philosophy and team building and outlook and vision is a lot different now, with brand new leaders at the helm, up top with Hilferty and with Danny Briere.
Okay. Where can people find your stuff and other work that you do?
Well, obviously, you can find me at DiMarco25 on Twitter. I do podcasts weekly with Jason Martinez, Stick to Hockey Live. I still appear on Brotherly Pod, not as frequently as I used to, but usually once or twice a month, and thefourthperiod.com. And
Fantastic.
If you catch the Montreal feed, which I know most people won't, but TSN 690, of course.
Oh, great. Yeah, well, you post those on Twitter. So if you follow at DiMarco25, you can get some of those replays.
Yeah, exactly.
And thanks a lot, man. We'll be talking to you more down the road, I'm sure.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it. And thanks for having me on. Really appreciate it.
All right. Anytime. You got it. Right. Yeah. So, Dan, you can be found on Twitter. Thanks again for playing hurt tonight, by the way.
Yeah, no problem. I'm going to go and drink get some broth. I got some soup from one of my favorite places tonight, Prescription Chicken. They got great stuff. And I'm going to, folks can find me on Twitter at dsilver88 and throw me a follow. Let's hope I feel better soon. And but it's always fun doing this podcast with you, and it was great to have Anthony on.
Yeah. It's definitely a lot of good stuff tonight. Appreciate it. And you can follow me at Isaiah ISAIAH _520 at Isaiah. Don't forget the _520 on Twitter, and of course the O&B Puckcast at O&B Puck at O&B Puck. Been a long one tonight. I think it's been one of our best. Until next time, everybody, take care.